They called it the Whistling Death, a machine so fast, so furious, that even the most skilled Japanese pilots dared not face it head-on. But on one strange morning in 1944, fate decided to silence that roar. The sun rose over the blue Pacific, the waves calm, the sky deceptively peaceful. High above, a formation of F4U Corsairs cut through the air, wings bent like the claws of a hawk, engines screaming as if tearing the sky itself. Among them was Lieutenant Robert "Hawk" Jensen, 23 years old, confident and fearless. He had already survived 31 missions and believed the Corsair was untouchable. But that day, the ocean had other plans. A sudden flash, a single burst of anti-aircraft fire from an island below. One shell found its mark. The Corsair lurched. Smoke filled the cockpit. Jensen's right engine cylinder blew apart. The propeller slowed, coughing black clouds of oil. He pulled the stick, trying to keep her steady, but the machine shook violently. Altitude dropped. 8,000 feet. 6,000. 4,000. He bailed out. The parachute bloomed open, white against the endless blue, and moments later, the Corsair plunged nose first into the jungle canopy of a remote island under Japanese control. The wreck was lost to the world. But to a small group of Japanese engineers, it was about to become the most valuable discovery of the entire war. 2 days later, a small truck rolled into a military hangar on the outskirts of Yokosuka Naval Base. Covered in mud and smoke, the wreck of the Corsair was unloaded piece by piece. The twisted propeller, the shattered cowling, the massive radial engine, blackened and scarred, but somehow intact. Among the crowd of officers stood a man who wasn't wearing medals or ribbons. Just a gray engineer's coat, oil-stained and worn thin. His name was Masaru Okabe, 32 years old. A naval engineer, not a soldier, and yet, in the eyes of his peers, a man bordering on dangerous. Because Okabe didn't believe in propaganda. He believed in machines. When the officers left, Okabe stayed behind, walking slowly around the wreck, his fingertips tracing the burned fuselage. He whispered softly to himself, "They call this the Corsair. Let's see what it really is." As weeks passed, his small team began the impossible, to take apart an American masterpiece, bolt by bolt, and understand how it had changed the air war. What they found shocked them. The Japanese Zero, their pride, was light, agile, and graceful, but fragile. Every shot that hit it meant death. The Corsair, on the other hand, was a flying fortress. Its skin was thick, its wings strong, its engine powerful enough to tear free from gravity itself. Even damaged, it could climb faster than most planes could dive. Okabe and his assistant, Taro Kameda, measured every inch of the Pratt & Whitney engine. They couldn't believe the precision. Not a single misaligned bolt, not one wasted ounce of steel. The alloy used for the pistons was something they had never seen before. The compression ratios, the supercharger design, the heat distribution, everything about it screamed efficiency beyond imagination. Okabe wrote in his notes, "This engine does not fight the air, it commands it." It was an admission few in Japan dared to make, that their enemy had built something so far ahead of them, it might as well have been alien. But fascination soon turned into obsession. Night after night, Okabe stayed in the hangar long after the lights went out. He'd study the shape of the wings, tracing the lines where metal met rivet, where stress met strength. He began to sketch, not copies but improvements. He imagined a new aircraft, one that combined the Corsair's brute force with Japanese finesse. Something light enough to maneuver, yet strong enough to survive. He named it secretly in his notebook, Project Raijin, the god of thunder. His idea spread quietly through the engineering staff, whispers of a design that could end the Allied advantage. But the higher-ups were furious. To them, Okabe's fascination wasn't innovation, it was treason. No Japanese officer wanted to admit that their enemy could build something superior. When Okabe proposed that Japan should study, not destroy, American technology, one commander slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "We do not learn from our enemies. We defeat them." But Okabe didn't stop. He couldn't. because deep down he knew, if they didn't understand this level of engineering, Japan's war was already lost. Outside the hangar, the war was turning. American bombers were now reaching the mainland. Tokyo burned nightly under silver streaks of firebombs. Supplies were vanishing. The empire was cracking. And yet, in that small, dimly lit hangar, a handful of men kept working, measuring, testing, recording, driven not by nationalism but by curiosity. When they powered the Corsair's damaged engine for the first time, it coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. The ground trembled. Sparks flew from the exhaust. Men covered their ears as the sound filled the entire base. One officer yelled, "Shut it down before it explodes." But Okabe smiled, because to him that roar wasn't a threat. It was truth. It was the sound of progress, something beyond politics, beyond war. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, "Do you hear it, Kamita? That's what the future sounds like." Word spread. Other engineers from Nakajima and Mitsubishi secretly came to see it. One whispered, "It's like nothing we've built. It feels alive." They knew they were seeing something that would change everything they believed about machines. But it was too late. Japan didn't have the resources, the metals, or the time. Even if they could understand the Corsair, they couldn't replicate it. Still, Okabe refused to give up. He smuggled his sketches out of the base, hiding them inside hollow machine parts, disguised under shipping manifests. He began corresponding in secret with a young American-educated metallurgist still in Tokyo. They exchanged notes, formulas, theories. It was a silent rebellion, men of science defying the war's madness. Okabe wrote one final entry in his journal that night. "Machines do not care who builds them. They only care who understands them." In the following weeks, Allied raids intensified. The airfields became ruins. Factories turned to ash. Okabe's hangar was ordered evacuated, the Corsair wreck to be melted down for scrap. But before the trucks arrived, Okabe made a choice. He disassembled one cylinder of the Corsair's engine, the heart of its power, and sealed it inside a wooden crate. He labeled it as hydraulic test components. Then, under moonlight, he carried it to a hidden storage bunker on the edge of the base. He placed it there gently, as if burying a sacred relic. "Someday," he whispered, "someone will find this and understand." He walked away without looking back. Days later, Yokosuka was bombed. The hangar was obliterated. Most of Okabe's colleagues were either killed or reassigned. And the Corsair, or what was left of it, was lost beneath rubble and fire. Okabe survived, but barely. He never spoke of the project again. After the surrender, he disappeared into civilian life, working quietly as a mechanic in a small factory in Osaka. To most, he was just another man fixing engines to survive. But in his home, locked in a small chest, lay the last surviving sketches of the Corsair he once studied. They were burned around the edges, stained with oil, and on the final page, written in English, not Japanese, were 6 simple words. "The enemy taught me to think." Years later, people would talk about Japan's post-war industrial miracle, how the nation went from ruin to rebuilding the most advanced machines on Earth. But few would ever know that, hidden behind that story, was a man who had once dared to study the enemy's wings, and in doing so discovered the true meaning of progress. "Hey, old man," the officer called out, smiling. "Used to work on planes?" Okabe hesitated, then nodded. The officer grinned. "Good. We're cleaning out an old airbase nearby. Could use a hand if you know your way around a wrench." It was an odd offer, an enemy soldier inviting a former Imperial engineer to help dismantle American planes. But Okabe went. What he found there would change everything again. Inside the hangar, under a roof half-collapsed from bombing, stood rows of aircraft. Not Japanese but American, wrecked Corsairs, Avengers, Mustangs left behind after the war. Machines that had once rained fire upon his homeland, now waiting to be scrapped and forgotten. Okabe walked slowly among them, fingertips grazing the cool metal. He felt no anger, only awe, because even in ruin, these planes carried a kind of beauty, symmetry in destruction. The officer noticed him examining a broken cylinder and said, "Pretty things, aren't they?" shame to melt him down. Okabe didn't answer. He crouched beside the engine, turning a bolt with his bare hands, feeling the precision. Then he whispered, almost reverently, "They were never just weapons. They were ideas made to fly." The officer tilted his head. "Guess that's one way to see it." Okabe smiled faintly. "It's the only way." Days turned into weeks. Okabe began helping them regularly, repairing parts, cataloging pieces, even showing younger Japanese workers how to dismantle propeller assemblies safely. But secretly, he was studying again. Every detail, every design choice. He wanted to understand not just how the Americans built, but how they thought. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not won with guns or bombs, but with the courage to learn when others only want to destroy. And as history would soon reveal, the day Japan captured that Corsair was not the day they gained an airplane. It was the day they gained a teacher. The war had ended. But for Japan, victory and defeat were meaningless words, because there was nothing left to win or lose. Cities had turned to ash. Factories were gone. Men who once built planes were now melting their own pots and pans for metal. And in a quiet workshop on the outskirts of Osaka, Masaru Okabe, the man who once touched the wings of the Corsair, sat in silence before a small, rusted engine block. The Allied occupation had begun. American troops filled the streets. Signs in English appeared everywhere. For many, it was humiliation. For Okabe, it was a strange kind of déjà vu, because the sound of those engines rumbling through the streets was familiar. The same growl, the same precision, the same machines he once studied behind barbed wire and secrecy. But now they were everywhere, not as enemies but as reminders. He could have walked away from it all. He could have buried the memories, the notes, the obsession. But he couldn't, because even in defeat, he was still an engineer. And engineers don't forget what they've seen. One cold morning in 1946, a convoy of trucks rolled past his workshop, carrying disassembled fighter parts. Curious, Okabe stepped outside, wiping oil from his hands. A young American officer in a jeep noticed him staring and waved casually. He realized something profound. America's machines weren't perfect because of their materials, they were perfect because of their mindset. They believed in iteration, in trying, failing, and improving endlessly. Where Japanese engineers were taught never to make mistakes, Americans built from them. It was freedom translated into metal. One afternoon, while working under a half-lit hangar, Okabe found a crate with stenciled letters. Pratt & Whitney are 2800 service components. The same engine that had powered the Corsair. His heart stopped. He asked permission to inspect it for educational purposes. The Americans shrugged. Why not? The war was over. So Okabe opened the crate. And there it was, a pristine cylinder head, polished, untouched. The exact same piece he had once hidden in secret under the floor of his old lab. He ran his hand across it slowly, whispering, "You came back to me." That night he stayed late, measuring everything with trembling hands. But he wasn't copying this time. He was learning. Weeks later, word spread of a new initiative. The Allied Occupation Authority was hiring skilled Japanese technicians to help rebuild the nation's industry. They needed men who could teach others how to work with engines, pumps, tools, anything mechanical. Okabe applied. He didn't tell them about the Corsair. He didn't have to. They saw his hands, scarred, steady, experienced. And they hired him. His assignment: to train young Japanese apprentices in the basics of precision mechanics. At first, he was skeptical. These were boys barely out of school, untrained, untested. But as weeks turned into months, he saw something extraordinary. These kids, hungry, curious, fearless, reminded him of the energy he once saw in American factories. They didn't carry the burden of pride or propaganda. They simply wanted to build. For the first time in years, Okabe felt hope. He taught them everything he remembered, not from textbooks, but from experience. How the Corsair's cylinders stayed cool under pressure. How its air intake used geometry, not force, to breathe better. How its structure absorbed shock instead of resisting it. He didn't say these lessons came from an enemy machine. He just said, "Learn from everything." even from what you don't understand. Slowly, a generation began to rise. A generation that didn't see America as an enemy, but as a teacher. They worked harder than anyone expected. And their small repair workshop became something else entirely, a seed of innovation. In time, that seed would grow into the roots of Japan's new engineering revolution. But progress never comes without ghosts. Late at night, Okabe still dreamed of the Pacific, of burning skies, falling planes, and the roar of engines. He would wake up sweating, hearing that same sound, the Corsair's whine echoing through the dark. One night, unable to sleep, he walked to the abandoned storage shed near the old Yokosuka base. Now overgrown, forgotten by everyone. He dug through the rubble until his hands hit something solid. The crate, still there. He pried it open. Inside lay the same cylinder he had hidden during the war, the last surviving heart of the Corsair. Untouched. He carried it back to his workshop, cleaned the rust, and placed it on a pedestal like an artifact. To anyone else, it was just metal. To Okabe, it was a memory of everything he'd lost, and everything he'd learned. He decided it would never be used again. Not for war, but as a reminder. He told his students, "This machine once killed thousands. But its purpose was not destruction, it was understanding. Learn from it, and we'll never need to build something like it again." The room went silent. None of them dared to speak, because they understood what he meant. Years passed. Factories reopened. Japan began exporting steel, electronics, automobiles. And though few remembered his name, Okabe's influence lived quietly inside every engine that rolled out of those plants. He had passed on more than knowledge, he had passed on a philosophy. That precision is not born from fear, it's born from curiosity. In a narrow alley of Osaka, Okabe's old students worked inside a crowded factory that smelled of oil and determination. They weren't soldiers. They weren't heroes. They were young men and women trying to turn rust into future. Every morning, they opened the shutters and let sunlight pour over the steel tables. They'd start their day with one ritual, touching the Corsair cylinder mounted on the wall. Not for luck, but for memory. It reminded them that progress was not born from pride. It was born from learning. The label below it read, "The engine that taught us to live." Okabe had passed away 2 years earlier, quietly, in his sleep. But his words lingered in every blueprint, every bolt, every choice they made. And as Japan rose from the ashes, those words became their compass. "Never build to copy," he used to say. "Build to understand." By 1956, Japan's economy was breathing again. The government encouraged engineers to innovate, to compete, to dream. Factories reopened in Nagoya, Yokohama, Tokyo. And for the first time in a decade, the whine of engines meant progress, not death. Among the thousands of workshops sprouting like weeds, one small company began drawing attention. It was called Shinsei Precision Works, New Star. It was founded by 3 of Okabe's former apprentices. By 1953, Japan's new industrial boom was unstoppable. Engineers who once studied under Okabe began designing their own machines, ones faster, smaller, cleaner. When American observers returned to inspect post-war progress, they were stunned. Factories that had been rubble 8 years earlier were now producing engines nearly on par with the U.S. Navy's own. One officer reportedly muttered, "How the hell did they do this so fast?" No one could answer, but somewhere in a small workshop in Osaka, an old man smiled. Because he already knew the answer. He had seen it the day he looked inside that Corsair engine, the day he learned that freedom of thought builds faster than any empire ever could. Before his death in 1957, Okabe wrote a final letter to his apprentices. It wasn't grand or dramatic, just a few lines of reflection, written in calm, deliberate strokes. "We once built machines for war. Now we build them for progress. That is the true victory, not of nations, but of minds." His students kept that letter framed in their workshop, and above it they mounted the Corsair cylinder. Polished, preserved, shining like silver. No one called it the whistling death anymore. They called it the engine that taught us to live. The sound was different now. Not the thunder of warplanes, but the hum of workshops, the rhythm of drills, lathes, and hammers. Across Japan, a new symphony had begun, one made not of destruction, but of rebirth. Kondo, who could fix anything with his hands. Hayashi, who saw mathematics like music. And Nakamura, a quiet draftsman who rarely spoke but could design miracles on paper. They started small, repairing farm pumps, making bearings for fishing boats. But they wanted more. They wanted to build something that could honor their teacher. One night, over cheap sake and flickering candlelight, Kondo said, "Sensei taught us that engines are not just machines. They're promises. So let's make one that promises a future." Hayashi smiled. "A future that breathes," he said. Like his Corsair. They didn't have the money. They didn't have government backing. But they had something rarer, belief. So they began sketching. Designs of a small, air-cooled engine that could power anything, a generator, a boat, maybe even a small vehicle. A new heart for a new Japan. They called it Project Hikari. Light. Weeks turned into months. The workshop became their world. The air was thick with heat and hope. Every bolt they turned, every piece they machined, carried the ghost of Okabe's philosophy. When the prototype finally roared to life, it wasn't perfect. It sputtered, coughed, and nearly tore itself apart. But to them, it was the sweetest sound in the world. They gathered around it like proud parents. Kondo laughed, covered in oil. "It's alive," then smiled faintly. "From a man who studied your Corsair." The American blinked. "The F4U Corsair?" Kondo nodded. He said its engine taught him how to think. And he taught us how to listen. The man chuckled softly. "Well," he said, "looks like the lesson stuck." He introduced himself as Commander James Riley, an engineer who had served on aircraft carriers in the Pacific during the war. Now, he was part of an Allied research commission studying post-war technology exchanges. He asked for permission to test the engine. A week later, his report came back. Compact, efficient, elegantly designed. A balance between precision and simplicity. The most human engine I've ever seen. The review spread quietly through engineering circles. Within a year, Shinsei Precision Works received its first major contract to design auxiliary generators for naval docks. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were now building for the same navy that once bombed their homeland. But Kondo told his team, "This isn't irony. This is evolution." Sensei said, "One day, machines built for destruction will build peace instead." And so they did. Hayashi nodded. Sensei would say, "Let it breathe better." So they did. They redesigned the intake, rebalanced the crankshaft, and reinforced the pistons. Bit by bit, they made it smoother, stronger, more efficient. It wasn't American. It wasn't Japanese. It was something new, a fusion of discipline and freedom. When the engine finally stabilized and ran clean for the first time, the entire workshop fell silent. No one spoke. They just listened. That sound, the steady hum of a perfectly tuned heart, was the sound of redemption. Months later, they brought their prototype to a government exhibition in Tokyo. Dozens of companies displayed flashy new machines, radio sets, cars, turbines. Shinsei's booth was tiny, tucked between two major corporations. Their engines sat on a wooden table, painted in silver, small enough to fit in a suitcase. Most visitors walked by without a glance. But one man stopped. An American, older, tall, wearing the insignia of the U.S. Navy on his lapel. He studied the engine closely, tracing its clean lines, the simplicity of its design. He turned to Kondo. "Where did you learn to build something like this?" Kondo hesitated. The company grew. By the early 1960s, Shinsei was exporting engines to Europe and America. Each one carried a tiny engraving inside its casing, invisible unless you dismantled the engine completely. It read, OKB, the initials of Okabe Kiyoshi, their silent tribute. But even as their success rose, the founders never forgot where it began, with that captured Corsair, and a man who refused to stop learning. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, they gathered at the workshop, lit incense beside the cylinder, and read aloud his final letter. Then they'd say, together, "We build not for war, not for pride, but for understanding. In 1965, during a visit from American engineers, Commander Riley returned, older now, walking with a cane. He toured the facility and marveled at their progress. When he saw the Corsair cylinder on display, his eyes softened. "I remember these," he whispered. "They used to terrify us." Hayashi smiled. "Now they inspire us." Riley placed his hand on the metal, closing his eyes. "I guess this is what victory really means," he said quietly. "Not flags, not weapons, but wisdom." The room fell silent, because they all knew the war had ended years ago, but peace had just begun. By the 1970s, Japan was the world's engine of innovation. From motorcycles to ships to electronics, the heartbeat of every machine echoed with the same rhythm, the rhythm of curiosity that Okabe had passed down. No one outside the company knew the full story. The world saw only progress, not the ghost behind it. But the men and women of Shinsei knew better. They knew that history's greatest teacher was often hidden inside a story of defeat. Because sometimes, the only way to understand victory is to lose everything first. One rainy evening in 1973, Kondo visited a museum in Tokyo dedicated to aviation history. In a corner display, behind glass, stood a restored F4U Corsair, polished to perfection, blue paint gleaming under the lights. He stood there for hours, watching visitors pass by without realizing what they were looking at. A machine once called Whistling Death. He approached the plaque beneath it and read the words, "The Vought F4U Corsair, a marvel of wartime engineering, known for its unmatched speed, durability, and innovation." Kondo smiled faintly. They'd never know the rest of the story, how one captured machine had shaped an entire generation of engineers half a world away. He whispered under his breath, "You taught us more than you ever knew." Then he turned and left quietly into the rain. Years later, as Japan entered its golden age of technology, Shinsei Precision Works continued to thrive, but its founders grew old. When Kondo passed away, his ashes were placed in a small urn beside Okabe's cylinder. Hayashi followed a few years later. Their apprentices took over, young, driven, ready to lead the next wave. But they kept the promise. Every new engineer who joined the company learned the story of the Corsair, not from books, but from whispers. Because some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be understood. And somewhere, far away across the Pacific at a Naval Air Museum in Pensacola, Florida, a visitor walked past a row of restored planes and paused before a display. A guide was explaining the legacy of the Corsair, its role in the Pacific, its revolutionary engine design, its incredible performance. The visitor leaned closer, pointing at the exposed engine in the exhibit. "Strange," he said. "The cooling system looks a lot like a design I saw in a Japanese motorcycle engine once." The guide chuckled. "Yeah, funny, isn't it? Sometimes inspiration crosses oceans without anyone realizing it." The visitor nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not inspiration," he said. "Maybe it's respect." The guide smiled. "Maybe both." Back in Japan, the workshop lights burned through another night, new engineers working on new engines, tracing new dreams, and hanging above them, framed in steel and memory, was the old Corsair cylinder, shining quietly in the light. Not a trophy, not a relic, but a promise that even from the ashes of war, knowledge could fly again. Because sometimes the loudest victories are built in silence. It began with silence. The kind that comes after a storm, when the world is still deciding what it wants to become. By the early 1980s, Japan's skyline was no longer scarred by war. It shimmered with steel towers, neon lights, and the heartbeat of industry. The roar of engines that once powered warplanes now powered cars, ships, and dreams. And hidden inside those machines was something that few ever knew, the ghost of a Corsair, a whisper of an American design, perfected by the hands of men who had once been its enemies. But this wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of understanding, of how curiosity can survive even the darkest times. In a quiet room above Shinsei Precision Works headquarters, a new generation of engineers gathered for an annual tradition. They didn't wear suits or medals. They wore oil-stained overalls just like Okabe once did. In the center of the room, placed on a velvet stand, was the same Corsair cylinder, aged, dented, sacred. Every year they opened the glass case not to touch it, but to remind themselves why they were here. A young apprentice, barely 20, fresh from university, spoke softly. "Sir, this engine part it's from an American plane, right? Why do we still keep it?" The old foreman smiled, his hands trembling as he polished the metal. "Yes, from a Corsair, captured long before your time." The boy frowned. "But it was our enemy's machine." The foreman nodded. "That's exactly why it matters." He turned to face the young team and said the same words Okabe had once told his students. Words that had been passed down like scripture. War destroys knowledge. Curiosity rebuilds it. The boy didn't understand fully, not yet. But he would, because this wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a cathedral, and that Corsair piece was their relic. Years passed. Engines changed. The world entered the digital age. Computers replaced drafting boards. Robots joined assembly lines. But the heartbeat of innovation stayed the same. In 1991, Shinsei was invited to collaborate on an international aerospace project, the first of its kind. Engineers from Japan, America, and Europe would work together to design a new generation of jet engines for civilian aircraft. For the first time, men from both sides of a once bitter war sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing ideas, not secrets. Among them was Kenji Hayashi, grandson of Okabe's student, and the new chief engineer at Shinsei. During a late-night session in Seattle, an American designer named Mark flipped through Hayashi's blueprints and paused. "This intake geometry," he said. "It's strangely familiar." Hayashi smiled. "Maybe it should be. It was inspired by the Pratt and Whitney radial engine." Mark looked up. "The one from the Corsair?" Hayashi nodded. "My grandfather said it was the most honest engine ever built. Brutal, but beautiful." Mark chuckled. "You know, my grandfather worked on that engine." The room went quiet. Two men, descendants of enemies, staring at each other across half a century of history, realizing they were both carrying the same torch. Hayashi extended his hand. "Then maybe this time," he said, "we build something together." Months turned into years. The collaboration became a symbol of unity. Engineers from former warring nations creating something that could carry humanity higher, faster, and safer. And when the first test engine roared to life on the runway, both men stood side by side, hands covering their ears, eyes filled with awe. Mark laughed through the noise. "Think your grandfather would believe this?" Hayashi smiled. "He'd say engines don't care who builds them, only why they're built." The jet screamed down the tarmac, lifted into the air, and vanished into the clouds. A thunderous echo of forgiveness. Decades later, a museum opened in Yokosuka, dedicated to Japan's engineering rebirth. Among the exhibits, early motorcycles, naval turbines, and aircraft engines, one display drew the biggest crowd. Behind glass, bathed in soft white light, stood a familiar object, the F4U Corsair cylinder, now perfectly restored, mounted beside an inscription. It read, "This engine part was captured in 1944 by Japanese engineers. Instead of copying it, they studied it. And from its lessons, they built an industry that reshaped their nation. Proof that even in war, knowledge can be shared, and that curiosity is stronger than hate." Visitors from around the world stood silently before it. Americans, Japanese, Germans, students, veterans. Some took pictures. Others simply stared. A child tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, is this from the bad guys or the good guys?" The man knelt beside him, smiling sadly. "From both," he said. "And from neither." The boy tilted his head. "I don't get it." The father pointed to the inscription again. "It means, sometimes history isn't about who wins or loses. It's about who learns." That night, long after the museum closed, the janitor passed the exhibit one last time before turning off the lights. The Corsair cylinder glowed faintly under the final lamp. Its metal surface, once scarred by fire and flight, now reflected peace. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear it breathe. Not the roar of an engine, but the soft sigh of understanding. Because this machine had seen it all: war, loss, curiosity, redemption. It had lived in the hands of those who fought and in the dreams of those who rebuilt. And though decades had passed, it still carried the same message it always had. That true power doesn't come from domination, it comes from discovery. Thousands of miles away, in a university classroom in California, Mark's grandson was giving a lecture on wartime innovation. He displayed a photo of the Corsair engine, describing its radial design, its incredible power, and its influence on post-war technology. A student raised her hand. "Sir, is it true that the Japanese learned from this engine?" He smiled. "Not just learned. They listened." Another student asked, "Do you think that's wrong? To use what was once an enemy's idea?" He paused for a long time, then answered softly, "Innovation has no enemies, only teachers." The room went silent, because everyone understood what that meant, that progress is not the property of any flag or nation. It belongs to those who dare to ask why. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the Shinsei factory still stood, expanded, modernized, humming with the future. Every day, engineers arrived to design the next generation of machines. On the lobby wall, engraved in brushed steel, were Okabe's final words: "The sky belongs to those who understand it." Below it hung an old black and white photograph. Okabe and his students, smiling in front of the captured Corsair, unaware that they were holding the blueprint for their country's rebirth. New workers often paused to look at that picture, not because it showed history, but because it showed hope. On a clear spring morning, the sound of jet engines filled the sky once again, not from warplanes, but from airliners crossing oceans. As one flew high above the Pacific, a passenger looked out the window and saw Japan glowing beneath the clouds. Cities that once lay in ruins now sparkled like constellations. He didn't know it, but inside the plane's engine were design elements born from that same Corsair, improved, evolved, reborn. The legacy of a single mechanic's curiosity, carried by generations who refused to stop asking questions. From the ashes of conflict to the heavens of progress. A full circle drawn in metal and memory. And so, the story of the F4U Corsair in Japan did not end in 1944. It lived on in the machines that carried peace, in the engines that bridged worlds, and in the people who learned that knowledge, once shared, could never be captured again. Because some machines are not just built to fly, they're built to teach. And long after the fires of war are gone, their lessons still echo. In every engine that hums, in every sky that remembers, in every hand that dares to build again.